Welcome. We'll get started shortly. Before we begin, here's how to earn continuing professional education credit for attending this session. There are no polling questions or attendance checks. Instead, you will demonstrate your knowledge by taking a brief multiple-choice quiz using the Earmark app. Visit earmark.app in your web browser. You can also download the mobile app by scanning the QR code on the screen. Log in, or if you're new, create your free account. Be sure to use a valid email address because that's where we'll send your course completion certificates. From the home screen, scroll down to find the course. You can also tap the magnifying glass icon to search for the course. Tap on the course artwork, then the Enroll button. On the Course tab, you'll find the recording and quiz questions. Complete the quiz to earn your CPE certificate. It takes us a few days to create the course on the app, so if you are attending this session live, please wait a few days. We'll email you a link to the course when it is ready. If you have questions or need help, email us at support@earmarkcpe.com. And now, on to the event.
Hello, and I am so excited to be presenting to you all. My name is Simone, and what we're going to get into today is talking about cannabis accounting and specifically cannabis internal controls. How you can strengthen them in your practice as a CPA. So let's get going. I hope you're excited. I definitely am. And so I want to start with a quick question for you. Just ask yourself this. We're in 2024 right now. What do you think is harder, getting cannabis banking or keeping your internal controls in check? And I think you know where we're going because this is an event about cannabis internal controls. And banking is a little bit more accessible than it used to be, and I'll talk about this in this presentation. But the goal of this is to really dive deep into one of the most important things that as accountants we should be working on with our clients, no matter what type of services we are giving, and specifically for cannabis businesses, is to really support them with building strong internal controls. And so what we're going to learn today is I'm going to give you an overview of the nuances of the cannabis industry. And this is going to allow you to be able to dive into internal controls and supporting internal controls with the cannabis operators faster because you have a baseline of understanding about the industry. And then I'm going to talk to you about some of the most important internal controls that you're going to want to be focused on in your business and in your client's business, and then giving you actionable steps to actually getting started. So as we go through this, I just want you to take a moment and to set some intention here, because what we're doing is really powerful. It's powerful for you to be able to learn something new as well as to support your clients in a new way. So just set your intention. Is it to learn a new cannabis internal control? Is it to take action to finally work with a cannabis client? Just set your intention as we get through this training. And a little bit about me. So my name is Simone Samluka-Radzins, if you don't know me. And I have been operating in the cannabis industry since 2015, which during those times we called the Wild, Wild West. I'll talk a little bit about that as we really get into the cannabis industry in itself and just the complete transformation that it's gone through over the course of these last almost 10 years. I am a former PwC auditor. I spent the beginning of my career at PwC in assurance, where I was set up perfectly to work in the cannabis industry, where I had clients in agriculture. So some of my very first inventory counts were literally smelling and counting vats of wintergreen oil, which we can easily translate to cannabis oil. I'll tell you a little bit about that. I worked in manufacturing, so doing cycle counts and inventory counts, and I also did retail. And after spending some time in public accounting, I moved to internal audit for entertainment and then also for tech. And within that space, it really was much more of a management consulting role. And so being able to look at, and it's important as we get into this process and talk about cannabis accounting, to be able to look at the business holistically, looking at the sales process, the inventory process, the billing process, the HR process, the finance function, right? All of this holistic view allows us to really think about internal controls. And it was in 2015 when I decided to actually leave my corporate job and and pursue a career in entrepreneurship. And I just happened to be, I was in California at that time and happened to look at a magazine learning about the cannabis industry or the marijuana industry. And I thought, wow, this is a very, very interesting industry. I had no idea about it. And what is this all about? So I spent a year before I really decided what I wanted to do to really understand this industry, because it is a complex industry, which I'll talk to you about. There are many different parties. It's highly regulated. Everything is constantly changing. And one of the things that I noticed right away is that there wasn't a lot of clarity on accounting guidance, a lot of clarity on actually best practices. And I am not a tax CPA or a specialist, and there was a lot of stuff about taxes. And so I used my internal control background and my framework to really build out a roadmap to see how I could support these cannabis businesses. And at that moment, and what you're going to notice as you're working with cannabis businesses, even if we're in 2024, is that it's a really startup focused environment. People are just getting licenses. There is a startup energy around it. There's a compliance energy around it. And there's a hold on, let me still get traction around it. So as you will work with cannabis clients, some of the services that you're going to provide or have been providing might stray a little bit away from your traditional types of accounting. And so I've supported clients with capital raising, business planning, and really profit improvement. And you're going to see as we go through this presentation that profit improvement, there's a direct tie to internal controls. And you've probably seen this underneath here now, Cannabis Business Minds. So that's a podcast, it's a website, and there's resources and tools to support cannabis businesses with their accounting and really supporting them being able to build a profitable business. So you can check out that podcast. And I'm an American, obviously, born and raised in Portland, spent most of my time in California, and I currently live in Portugal. So I'm definitely having a remote practice and excited to meet everybody and just allow you to learn a little bit more about cannabis internal controls. So if we've got some people live, and I'm just curious, who do we have in the room in terms of what type of services are you providing? Because a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about will really fall into like client service, additional services, CAS, or fractional CFO work. And if you've actually had experience working with cannabis clients, or if you're thinking about it. Now, luckily, if you've been operating in the cannabis industry already with clients, you will learn some great new stuff. And if you're completely new, I've got you covered as well. So if you want, you can put it in the chat. I'll look at it at the very end. And when I first got into the industry, and why I'm really excited to give you this presentation, is that cannabis businesses really do need great accountants. And not just your average accountant, but really awesome accounting manager, really great accountants, those that like to solve problems. Because this industry is one of the most dynamic industries. It is fast paced, it's exciting, there's rules, there's regulations, things change all of the time. And that's exciting, right? So as a business owner, we all know that if we're dealing with business owners, they have one view, one thing. And then we also have this unfortunate thing that does not really go away in the cannabis industry, which is regulation, high taxes related to the regulation, as well as related to the federal stance of cannabis currently in the United States. And we have rules and regulation of these cannabis businesses. And unfortunately, because of the high taxes and the high compliance and the associated costs with those, a lot of these businesses have low margins. Gross margins, not so much. Profit margins, yes. And they're inventory-based businesses, right? So I've noticed talking to a lot of accountants, maybe that's not your favorite, right? Because we come into the idea about cost accounting. We come into the idea about inventory reconciliations, about valuation, about all of these different things. And so being part of this and supporting clients, you have to really embrace these things. And what's nice is that when you can embrace them, you really can support them in building a profitable business with the rules that have been given. So I want to get into cannabis being a highly regulated industry. It's one of the most highly regulated industries I've worked in. And there are several reasons why. The first is that as of this recording, cannabis is a Schedule I substance. So I'm not sure if you can see that to the right of the slide, but in 1970, the Controlled Substance Act was implemented in the government. And the CSA schedules drugs based off of a 1 to a 5. A 1 is highly addictive, no medical value. That is marijuana or cannabis, and that is also heroin and fentanyl and the likes. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this is because of the scheduling, there is a punitive tax code at the federal level called IRC 280E. In essence, it allows cannabis businesses to deduct one thing, which is the cost of goods sold. Meaning, if you're deducting the cost of goods sold, i.e., the cost of cannabis, we're not allowed at the federal level to deduct accountants, to deduct marketing, selling, most of the labor expenses, right? So it's quite punitive in nature. Luckily, it seems like we are going to be moving forward. In 2025, it looks to be scheduled as a 3. And so when we think about that, the scheduling will allow that federal tax code to go away. There's also some differences when we think about what is cannabis, because you might have heard about hemp, you might have heard about CBD, and then you might have heard about THC. So THC is where we're really focusing on this presentation, on this workshop. And that is more of the psychoactive. You have to have the adult use license. Cannabis is legal in California, Arizona, all these certain things, right? So that's THC. CBD, there's sets of rules and regulations for that. CBD is 0.3% or less THC and is governed underneath the Farm Bill. So federally, CBD is legal. We're not talking about this for this presentation, but it's important for you to recognize, because some of the businesses that you might be supporting in accounting might have both of these as part of their revenue streams. There's also a very interesting thing about the regulation. I couldn't believe how much I started to really dive into understanding the rules and the regulations. So if you have a cannabis license, there's a series of regulatory requirements related to your inventory, related to how you have your security cameras, related to what time you can be open. Like, there's so many regulatory requirements, books and records as well, right? So all of these are at a state level to have a state license. So if you have a cannabis business that has operations in California and operations in New York, they will have 2 sets of regulations in both of those states, right? So as the accountant, as somebody that needs to be understanding and aware of the regulations that are going to impact your internal controls, it's really important to know. Furthermore, there's local regulations, and that's just in certain states. And so why this is all important is that it impacts accounting. It impacts, your rules, the internal controls that you're going to have, and even understanding clearly like taxes and insurance. And as we get into thinking about cannabis insurance, as well as banking, is that both, because it's federally illegal, right? So the Schedule 3 substance will shift federal legalization, right? So because currently it's Schedule 1 federally illegal, insurance, you can absolutely get insurance for a cannabis business. What you'll want to make sure of is that you are clearly insured in all areas and you can understand the gaps in coverage. Banking is accessible for most cannabis businesses, especially now in 2024. In 2015, it wasn't. However, not every cannabis business has a bank account, and usually these banks have strict compliance and high fees, meaning that a cannabis business might have just one cannabis bank account. Right, so banking, we're still not at the best area yet in banking. And then compliance, I think I've alluded to it, right? We are in a highly compliant area because of the rules and regulations set forth by the governing bodies in those states. And then seed to sale tracking is all about making sure that you can track your cannabis from seed, right? So from cultivation, I'm going to show you in the next slide what that looks like, all the way to get to the end consumer. And the reason why we have seed to sale tracking is that one of the biggest risks in the cannabis industry is that the risk of diversion. That product could be diverted to the illicit market. That product could be in the access of cartels. That cannabis product could be in the hands of children, right? So this is why we have such strict compliance in this industry. So we're clearly set up, right? So now we can understand that we've got risk and we've got a lot of areas where we need to put some control in. And so for you that are not yet aware of the cannabis supply chain, this is a quick overview of it. all of these is basically mirroring that seed to the sale. So cultivation is, being able to grow your cannabis. There's different license types. Are you growing it outdoors, indoors, a mixed light, different sizes? That cannabis, once it's grown, can be put into a different product. So it can be manufactured, right? So all the accounting will be very different, right? So manufacturing that product into an oil or into an edible or into a vape pen, right? So these are the different types of product. And then cannabis has to be transported and distributed from license to license. So we also have a distributor type of license that's going to vary in different states. We have retailers, right? So that's actually facing the end consumer. So in certain states, that could be a dispensary, a delivery service. In California, in Los Angeles, they've got cannabis cafes. And so it's important, as you understand the supply chain, that every aspect, every type of business underneath these different categories is going to have a very different set of risks that are associated with it, right? So the risk in cultivation is going to be quite different than the risk in retail. The biggest thing is, if I think about retail and just the operational sense, is that, am I selling cannabis correctly? Is it packaged well? Is it compliant? Am I selling to the right type of people, right? So that's probably the biggest risk in retail. And the cultivation is going to be very different. So as you're getting in there, and I'll teach you how to do a risk assessment for each of these areas, it's really important to recognize that each license is quite different. So let's get into the internal controls. So as I mentioned, my background is audit and then internal audit, and I live and breathe these. And so when I started my business, I thought everybody wanted internal controls. Nobody did. And so you kind of like, if you do plan in your own business to, as a practice, to, support clients with this, labeling as internal controls might not be that, but it's really going in through a process to identify and create internal controls. So the one control framework that I was taught was the COSO framework, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. And what I like about this framework is it clearly defines, it's a cube that we're looking at. And if you look at the top of the cube, we think about strategy, right? Strategy of the business. We think about operations of the business. We think about reporting. How are we reporting the operations, right? So accounting obviously is one of them, and then compliance through. So that's the top. What I'm going to walk you through now, though, in this presentation is this top part, right? So thinking about our control environment, the actual ecosystem of where that business is operating, the leadership team of that business. We're going to dive deep into a risk assessment. This is going to be really key. It's a tool that you can use working in any industry, and I'll specifically teach you some of the risk associated with cannabis businesses. And then once we've identified risks, we want to control the risks, right? And so that is our control activities. So I'll teach you control activities in the key areas that I find the most risky in cannabis businesses. And then information and communication. We can design things, we can do things in boxes, but we want to make sure that the people and the stakeholders in the organization are actually using the control activities as designed. So how do we inform people? How do we communicate this well? And then we have monitoring activities. And those monitoring activities are, hey, did this actually work? Is our control working as designed? Right? So this is where in an internal audit, which I totally think you should incorporate into supporting cannabis clients, is really, really beneficial for you and for them. Because at the end of the day, if a cannabis business isn't compliant, if they're not compliant with the state rules, or the local rules, they could lose their license. And if you could lose your license and your license is only really valid for 1 year, that's a big risk for continued business operations. So it's not a joke when you really think about control. But I want to get into the control environment. The cannabis industry has changed in terms of the leadership and the maturity of the business and overall the ecosystem since when I started in 2015. However, it's important that as you work with cannabis businesses, that you really have solid and clear conversations with the owners to understand the type of leadership that they have. Because ethical leadership in this industry is so very much needed. And there are certain players that are not that. So you want to make sure, especially as licensed professionals, that you are doing your own due diligence when you're working with people and business owners. Anti-fraud measures are very much important. Embezzlement happens in every small business. Imagine an environment where it's mostly cash and really very valuable inventory that people want on an illicit market, right? So it's very ripe for misappropriation of assets and the need to actually have these conversations at a very top line level. Because with the control environment, when I like to think about the control environment, it's really thinking about the leadership team, right? So the leadership team could be maybe C-suite, but not fully in the operations, but also the operational team of what is the tone at the top. So the tone at the top is really important to be thinking about and having these conversations, right? So it's a needed thing to make sure that everybody is on board to have a very, compliance focused business. And those are the ones that are the most successful. Now, what's very nice about this space is that when a business applies for a cannabis license, they're required to submit an application. And in that application, they have to detail out several things, including a business plan, which is nice, but including standard operating procedures related to certain core functions of their business, usually related to inventory, product testing, operations, and potentially, depending on the license type, sales. So what that gives you is that already gives you a tool when you're working with them to say, well, let me see the standard operating procedures that have already been written, right? So you're already going to have that. Where you're going to see a control breakdown, or maybe just a non-existent control, is that might have just been used for an application. And so then the work is to, okay, let's actually put this into the business. So this is our control environment. Our risk assessment. So what I like to think about is every we have risks. Our life is a very risky thing. And the idea about risks is to be able to quantify the risk, to qualify the risk, to assess the likelihood of the risk, and to really understand how we can mitigate the risk. And so as you perform a risk assessment, the idea about this is to go through and understand at the strategic level and the operational level, what are the risks that are impacting this particular business? So it really is very focused on, understanding that core license type. So what I want you to think about, though, is when you're going through that, there is the external, right? So what's happening, at the local level, the state level, the federal level, the environmental level, as well as the internal. And the internal, this is where we're really going to dive in. But the internal, if you can, because you are accountants, is to understand that the internal, I always think about finance as the center, and the sales, the inventory, the HR, every core process is related to that. So being able to holistically look at the internal risks. And I'm going to show you on another slide kind of what a risk assessment looks like. And obviously the big ones are employee theft, inaccurate financial reporting, right? Those to me are some of the biggest ones when we think about the core function of finance and accounting. And cash and inventory are the areas that have the biggest risk. So diversion, right? So it's now all of a sudden unaccounted for, misstatement, we didn't value it correctly, we didn't have the right information in our inventory counts, and then theft and fraud. So it is wild, and it's better though to know the risks and then plan accordingly. And so this, I hope you can see it. And this is really an example. And so I designed this right when I got into this space. But as you can see over in that first column, it's the different category, right? So I like to think about category or kind of function in the business. So I'm going to just zoom in on myself if I can. Let's look at the cash management. So the risk could be high inventory levels. All right. So as you progress through your your risks and you create a risk register as your risk assessment, you want to understand the risk. Then you want to understand the cause of that. Why would we have high inventory levels? Could it be because we are not forecasting correctly, because our sales are low, because people are buying different product, because operations were at a standstill, right? There's different reasons as to why that risk could occur. And then coming up with the causes, so you can kind of dive deeper into that. And the reason we do risk assessments is to understand what control we can put in to mitigate the risk. because you're going to notice you could have, you've got thousands of risks in cannabis. You're probably a small team, and you might be the only person in the financial function. You can't obviously control all of those risks. And so that's why it's important to rate the risks and really look at, what's the likelihood of the risk and what is the impact of the risk. So only to focus on some of the high impact and high likelihood at the very beginning, right? Because you'll have your work cut out for you for quite some time otherwise. So this is just an example. I think on the blog I also have some stuff that you can look at, just to get clear on the risks. And so as we get into what I believe are some of the biggest risks, from an operational, obviously financial, in terms of just the risk of, to me, it's like the risk of losing our license, right? That is the bigger risk. The second risk is and so the risk associated with losing our license is diversion and safe access. Is it diverted? Are we not tracking the inventory? Was there somehow a diversion that took place? That the products that are under the license are not safe? And was there a risk there? When we look at some of the risks that come up, because you can look at each of the states' compliance fines, right? So in the state of California, there was a fine related to inaccurate, if you aren't able to furnish books and records when requested, so upon an audit, there could be like a $30,000 fine. And I was like, wow, this is just wild, right? And so again, likelihood of enforcement is one other thing, but when you look at the actual fines, some of them are related to diversion, safe access, inventory issues, right? So a lot of the things not being reported correctly in the inventory systems. And when I say inventory systems, what I'm talking about is the seed to sale tracking system that needs to be reported to the state for all of the cannabis movements. But more importantly, what I see is the cash management and liquidity. And so that's more from an operational and advisory standpoint, is that a lot of these businesses are just struggling to get by because of the high cost of doing business in such a regulated market. And where you can support them, and really the internal controls that I find are the most valuable, are related to making sure that cash is cash, right? That we are controlling cash. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. Inventory, and then much more operational is inventory forecasting, actually cash forecasting, right? So these are tools to support mitigating that risk, because profitability is everything and making really sound financial decisions. Compliance with tax. So in some states, I'm not a tax expert, but I've learned a ton working with tax experts. And what I've also learned is that if you owe the state money related to back cannabis taxes or back employment taxes, that's not a good thing. And your license could be revoked. So compliance with taxes is really important, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, getting into the rules and regulations to get clear on the taxes associated with that license type at the local level and the state level is everything. There was a big, I think that finally California changed how they were doing local taxes. But what happens is that people were unaware of how to calculate it. People were getting confused, doing weird things, maybe not paying it. And the end result is either a very big tax bill that they have to pay, which then impacts cash management and liquidity, or the loss of a license. So this is really important to make sure that you are focused on with your clients. And then records and retention, as I mentioned, a $30,000 fine, and just to not have books and records. Well, this is great. We're accountants. I think this is probably one of the best things that we're great at, is making sure that we have clean books and records, that we're documenting everything, that we have a nice storage file, and that we understand the rules and the regulations. Some of them are 5 to 7 years on specific things, right? So you might have a records requirement in a certain state for inventory reconciliations to be furnished, and they have to be furnished upon request, for up to 5 years. So having the system in place is everything. And then security risks. Security, this is a very, high cash, high cannabis. That's a lot of people want that. And fortunately, they have, they're depending on the state, there's security requirements that these cannabis businesses have, but there are a lot of risks as it comes to that. I mean, there's thefts, there's robberies, there's a lot of that is quite scary. And then also the risk of cyber, right? So these are more of the cannabis specific risks. So let's get into, okay, we've identified these. What is it that we can actually do? What are some control activities that we actually can do? So control activities, as I mentioned, these are just the actions we're going to take to mitigate the risks and to make sure that what we said we're going to do is what we're going to do. And so they can look like standard operating procedures. They can look like, process check-ins. They can look like, registers, logs, and approvals, right? So they're going to look different. It depends already. Like I mentioned before, go off of what has already been created. It's going to be the best because we can actually work off what was submitted. And my favorite activity in everything to reduce fraud or, fraud embezzlement is segregation of duties. So I'll show you a matrix in the next tab or in the next slide, but segregation of duties is everything in your core functions. And I'll show you how that would look in cash and in inventory. I don't have a slide, but making sure that not one person does the same thing is incredibly important. You'll find that information when you do a walkthrough and you can really understand kind of the business operations. And you don't have to do this alone. You'll have, there's probably an inventory manager, there's probably a compliance person. It's really gathering and building strong relationships with them to make sure that all of this can be done, right? So it's a lot of delegation. Reviews and approvals in core processes. We're not talking about SOX compliance here. We're talking about operational internal control. So let's not get wild with, the red tape because there already is so much, but making sure that in key areas related to cash and inventory, we've got a review and checker, a maker and checker process. Key reconciliations are required. So inventory reconciliations, inventory counts are required. So it's just making sure
Simone, it seems like we've lost Simone. She's frozen here. See if we can get her back on. Yeah, Angela, it seems like something happened to Simone's connection. Hold on, let me see if I can get her back on. Sorry, everyone. Just wait. There we go, Simone. You're back in now. If you could get your slides back up or get back to where we were.
Okay, guys, I am so sorry. And I am now, just so everybody knows, on my phone. Apparently the power went out and I had no idea. My husband came in, he's like, the power's out. I'm like, okay. So I apologize and I'm really bummed because I lost that chat. Maybe it's still there. But I will get back into it. I hope that
I have all at the end. If you want to ask me to go through the chat for questions, I can try to go through it for you.
Okay. Sweet. Wow. I was like, and hello guys, where are you? Okay. It's so funny. Thank you all for staying. So I'm just trying to figure out so we're talking about approval and then we've got the state mandated controls. So state mandated controls is everything. It will give you the foundations to know where to go. So that's why I'm like, it's so funny. We never thought we would work so deeply and closely with lawyers. I personally love reading the rules and regulations, but it is an activity in every state that you really want to do, specifically related to the inventory section, the insurance section. those to me are the biggest ones. You want to read everything, but that's going to give you, and then the reporting requirements section, those are the biggest ones that are going to give you actually the controls that need to happen. And I talked to you all about segregations of duties or segregation of duties. And ultimately, in a small business, it's quite hard to make sure that not every single employee can do everything and have keys to the kingdom. And so what you can do here is, this is where process and understanding those key components of what the steps need to do and need to happen are really important when you create a segregation of duty matrix. So here, this is assuming there's like 6 people in this example. We've got cash management, we've got sales and AR, and we've got payments. And so the activity would be to understand who's doing what, make an X, right? So you put the person's name, you would put an X, and then you would, kind of matrix it out and just say, okay, this makes sense. Like, this person has too many controls. There is a risk for fraud. And, I've had clients, I've said that, they're like, it's okay. So it's, again, we can tell everything. It's just our job to just inform. But to me, I'm like, just get the SOD, and you've already really mitigated a lot. And our control activities. So in cash, we obviously look at the SOD matrix, and then if a business is operating mostly in cash, the idea then is to understand the owner's system of how they are operating cash. So cash counts to make sure that we are getting accurate numbers of cash and that it matches the balance sheet. Cash logs to see the movement of cash, so you actually know where it's going, so then it can go with the financial records, are really important. And then one thing that I learned in the internal audit, and I actually looked at a lot of cash controls in casinos when I first got into this space, was petty counts, like petty cash counts, right? They're not petty cash, right? They're big cash counts, but who's doing the cash count? It's not, and then naming it, right? So you have a cash custodian, the person who's responsible for the cash, and then you would perform a cash count. If the cash custodian only performs the cash count, well, there is a likelihood that it might not be accurate. Something can be like slipped, right? And so it's also really important for us to be thinking about, okay, how do we do surprise cash counts? How do we have 2 people doing the cash counts, right? The review and the approval process here. Vaults and safes, that is already mandated. If you're located in the same state and you are working locally with a business, as part of your, client meetings, just do a surprise little audit and see, like, is it all working, right? Because it could be documented. It means that you've already gone through a section of the business to make sure that you feel comfortable with the whole process in itself. And then if you pay somebody $10,000 in a period of 12 months in cash, or within that 12 months, 1,000, 3,000, 5,000, et cetera, until it hits to 10, we have to file a Form 8300. The best processes that I've seen is it's already included in a vendor process or in a new client process. So you collect all the information, right? So that's just some of the extra federal compliance you'll need to do. And then bank compliance. And so the idea about bank compliance is, well, you're going to know from the bank what you have to do in terms of their compliance aspects. So all of this says we just first need to have really good books and records. That's how I think about it, right? So that's why it's like accounting is like the most needed industry in this space. And then with inventory, we have the risk of diversion. We have the risk of shortage or shrinkage or loss, of spoilage, and valuation. Right, and valuation, I'm not really going to talk about in this at all. It's much more of like the misappropriation of the assets. And so when we think about how do we make sure that we're good with better controls there, first, secure access, right? So making sure that there is a process, things are in order, it is secured, and and to get the license, they have to give a diagram to show how it's going to be. So it's not a lot of work on your end, it's to make sure that it is truly now working as designed. Inventory counts are everything. So we already know if we have to submit a reconciliation, we have to do an inventory count. Where there is a risk in inventory counts is, are they blind counts? Are they done with 2 people? Are they done with, 2 people, and blind counts are the biggest things. And then are we doing a full inventory count? Are we doing cycle counting? Right, so all of that information as you're building out the inventory processes is key. I'm even understanding and doing what I like to think about as like these process walkthroughs. So understanding from how is, if inventory is received, so how do we receive inventory? Where do we move the inventory? How do we track the inventory upon movements? What do we do if there's obsolete inventory, right? So understanding the whole process, what happens when there's an order, where does it get moved to, how does it get into the system, and just documenting that is all part of internal controls and developing the process. And then inventory reconciliations. Well, I'm talking to some great accountants and CPAs. So, the process is usually a three-way. So depending, right? So we've got the physical inventory count results. We've got what's in the seed to sale tracking, which should be what's in the inventory management system. However, that's not usually the case, right? And so this is usually upon investigations. Now, in certain states, there's a materiality level where you will want to, I'm not positive about them, so I can't tell you exactly what the percentage is or a dollar amount. But if it's above that percentage or if it's above the dollar amount, then you need to report that discrepancy to the state. So just understanding that as part of your process as well. And then what is so wild is that with IRC 280E, you cannot deduct cannabis inventory losses or just inventory loss. So again, very important that we can get clear and confident about inventory. Information and communication. All right. So as we roll into our next part, so we've assessed the risks, we've designed the controls, we've implemented the controls. Information and communication is about implementing the controls and making sure that they are working as designed. And so this again is looking at what do you need for formal information versus informal. A lot of these businesses are very informal, kind of startup. So what are the key areas? Who are the key people that need to know this information? Typically, I've noticed it's inventory managers. It depends on the license type, but inventory managers, compliance managers, maybe the COO. Those are the people that you'll probably be dealing with. And then if you design certain controls in sales, then obviously it would be the sales team because they're the ones that are usually collecting the cash, right? So that's why the sales team would be important. It's really building just a plan together with everybody. So as you kind of go into your risk assessment, it's not you in a silo doing it, it's you with the cannabis operations and management team. And then similarly, the information and communication strategy is the same. And this is kind of how do you roll out policies? How do you roll out procedures? It's going to vary. But the most important thing is tone at the top has to be there. And then you also have to have buy-in from, the people that are really doing the processes. And that usually is training, that is having some sessions to make sure that people are understanding it. And then monitoring. This is my favorite. And you can also bake this into how you're supporting. So KPIs are great, right? We can look at KPIs in terms of really great business financial metrics. So that's a monthly cadence you can have. And then we look at ongoing compliance audits, right? So just little mini things that you can do to make sure that things are rolling as planned. And again, this is going to matter about budget, priority, and the buy-in, but really great to do this on a quarterly or semi-annual cadence. And then building an internal review process that evolves as the regulation and market conditions change. So this is just, setting up an annual meeting. Do we need to update the risk register? Are things working? And what I think my favorite thing as an entrepreneur and somebody that loves internal controls is that this is like a full cycle process that can really support the business. And so I'm going to just cap this off. I think we've got about 5-10 more minutes into this. Is how do you actually, now I've given you some tools, what are we going to be successful with right now with cannabis internal control? So I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap. I am a firm believer of getting everybody on board. So initial planning with your client is everything. So if you are, have the luxury to kind of choose the clients, because I don't know how many people are employed versus, entrepreneurs and owning your own firm, but choosing the right clients, that due diligence is everything. You want to make sure that they're on board with what you are, what you are doing and what you have, about compliance, that they want to be, in the light with compliance. A risk assessment, what I used to do before working with every client, I still do it, but a risk assessment. There was a certain level of checklist for me to qualify somebody in this space because of the risk associated with, with my own profession. So that, we have ethics and we have to take ethics training. So it's really important to assess this. And then how I like to do every type of new project is that I like to do an audit of operations and finance. And that is, looking at the P&L, looking at the balance sheet, doing a quick review, asking key questions about the inventory, about the cash, about some of the biggest pains and challenges that management has. It doesn't have to be a full-blown day thing at all, especially if it's at the very beginning of a relationship. But it is important to think about that as part of your process of working with clients. And I have always been an advisor, and this is the industry where we really need cannabis accountants that are advisors. So really looking at that advisor and that problem solving hat, which is just so fun to do because you can really make moves there. And then you've got allies. So compliance people and lawyers are your biggest allies here because they're the ones that can really, give you a good download of what are the changes in the rules and the regulations, what's actually happening, what is boots on the ground, definitely the compliance people, so that you can be successful in it. And then the required SOPs, we have them in the license. Let's see what we actually have. Let's see what's working. Use that as the baseline. It will build so much efficiency in it, and it improves the bottom line. And then I think I've got two more, is document everything. We are in an area that is still gray, right? The law is changing, the rules are changing. If you decide to do things a certain way, I always like to document it, put it away in a file that this decision was made, the reason behind the decision. As you create, obviously, like financial forecasts or projections, the documentation of why you've done it, the methodology used, and any conversations, especially if you go that route where you take on a bigger role, and you are kind of like an advocate for your clients, and you're talking with regulators or you're talking with the IRS or the state, documenting all of that kind of stuff. I've never done that myself, but I would suggest making sure that all of that stuff has been documented. I'm a former auditor, so all I can tell you is, I guess I didn't tell you all this at the very beginning, but I've done tons of fraud investigations, Frank Dodd Act, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in my corporate life as well. And so, yeah, it's all about documentation. I just think about it on the flip side as well. So that's why I was so excited about the cannabis industry. And ultimately is to, if you're excited about this, to embody and become like the controls champion as part of your practice working with cannabis businesses. So I would love to open it up for some questions, but since I asked you all about this, giving you some information. I hope that a lot of this information was new for you. What is something specific, action-oriented that you can do today? What is it? I don't know. Maybe you can put it in the comments, but I always love to take action when we digest information. It's like, what action can you take? So that is my last question for you. And then you can shoot me an email. So one other thing that I'll tell you is I learned pretty quickly operating in the cannabis space. I had a book about IRC 280E like in 2015, and I sold it. I tried to sell it on my website, and I got my banking shut down. And so since then, I have like this Cannabis Business Minds, which is the podcast and the brand, but my business is Freedom Sun. So you can shoot me an email at Simone at Cannabis Business Minds. It will go to Simone at Freedom Sun. So you can absolutely shoot me any questions that you have about this. But I would love to open it up for a Q&A if we have any questions.
Yeah, so Simone, I don't know if you could see the starred questions that I put. I don't know if you see the early ones. It seems like Lori has a couple and Angela. I could bring them up on screen if this helps.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I see Angela. All right. So, okay, let me just hold on. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so Lori, working full-time as I know who specializes in back office when a company is learning that as they grow, their expenses are growing at the same pace and faster than revenue is growing. Been doing this for 15 years. On the side, I have a business doing what I call scrappy transformation for smaller non-Fortune 500s. Also have handled tax resolution cases and have gotten my feet wet in trust taxation. Maybe that's not a question, but Lori,
no.
That's amazing.
Do you see the starred questions? I could bring them. I can read them for you. Okay.
the
No
start.
problem.
Oh, I see them. I see them. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Has anyone here been to that big MJ Biz conference in Las Vegas? I went a couple years ago, but then just did not have the time to market for cannabis clients and wasn't sure about the risk with a full-time job still. All right. Yeah, I have been. I haven't been for a few. I've now lived in Europe for a few times. It's amazing. And it's overwhelming a bit because there's like 17,000 people, which is also great. And it's worth going because you will network so well. You'll meet a lot of people. I always think about building my business with like thought leadership and then referrals. So you would also be able to meet a lot of great people and just get to know people in the industry. It's especially as you get to work in the industry, you become very close with people and you can learn about some of the newest things. So I would suggest definitely going. I also think there's really great ways to market at a local level, especially if cannabis is legal at your state level. Some of the things that I've done is teamed up with Chamber of Commerce's and given presentations. I think that's the easiest one because people are looking for that support. So I hope that answers that question. And then Angela, what accounting systems are you using with to support your clients? So really, I am doing not as much like bookkeeping work at all. So right now I'm working with a client delivery service. They use a POS system and I'm helping them raise money. And then I realized I was like, okay, we need to like start really inventory forecasting. And so they're using QuickBooks. I know a lot of accountants will use QuickBooks for the actual accounting software and then do some type of journal entry or interface with the inventory management system. And so he's using Blaze, but particularly I'm doing a lot more advising than any of the bookkeeping. But I'm happy to ask some of my colleagues that are actively doing this. I think it goes to a level of how much revenue they have and what type of inventory movement that they have, because I worked with a lot of cultivators and cultivators do not have, we're talking about, you have to understand their harvest cycle and their sales cycles are very easy compared to, a distributor. That is movement. There's a lot more accounting, there's sales and marketing. Oh, and also, and this might have been a question here, but one of the things because of IRC 280E and because of how the lawyers were setting up these transactions, and because it's also smart depending on the strategy, is that there's multiple entities. And so one of the first things is you're like really getting clear is like mapping out how all of the entities flow. Because for a while, I was talking about this in my course, like for a while, people were setting these like management companies up to get around IRC 280E. But what ended up happening is that the IRS sniffed this out and was like, this clearly like substance over form here. You are the same entity. And what happened, I think this was in California. I don't know if it was a Harborside case. But what happened was they have a big tax penalty and the IRC 280 and the 280E deductions, right? They actually had to pay for. So please keep track of also the legal entities. Okay, Simone, does inventory of fluids change like it does with petroleum? Yes. So Lori, one of the things that so the question is really about like, does the inventory of fluids change? Yes. Like even when you have, so if we take the cannabis plant and we have flower and we have trim, and then we take trim, right? So then we're just gonna have some loss of inventory when it is dried, right? So we have wet weight and then we have dry weight. So this is where I wish I had met a lot of accountants that wanted to talk about this in 2015. Nobody did. And I'm not your traditional like controller or anything like that. So I didn't care so much, but this is where there needs to be more guidance about all of this stuff, because at the end of the day, it's that from the wet flower to the dry flowers one. And then from the processing, you're going to lose stuff because of the temperature and also the natural science behind it. So it is pretty wild. I don't know how material any of this stuff is. And again, my clients are less than 10 million, right? So it's more about how do you survive? How can we just truly build smart businesses? And I also like to get people in the team to do it. So I wish I would love to powwow and have a little mastermind more about that, but that's what I can share there. Also wondering what AI you are seeing as valuable as in the areas of AP now that we are beyond just straight OCR. Lori, I'm not sure. I think that there's going to be with AI. I don't know. I can't wait for the next earmark webinar about that. I started to dive a little bit into it, and there are some amazing providers that are revolutionizing just how accounting in itself is working, but I can't really speak to it. I'm sorry. Okay, I don't mind. Lori, just send me a message and let's like hop on a virtual coffee. Okay, so if this looks setting up. Oh, okay, wait. What tools are you using when setting up internal controls with your cannabis clients? Straight Visio and Excel or companies like? No, I mean right now I do things very easy. Like let's create the process. Let's create the checklist. I do Google Sheets, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not using any of the other like fancy tools because it's just easier for me. So I'm glad that that I could answer those. And thank you all. I think that what excites me is the level of questions in this. It has completely transformed. I think that a lot of accountants were scared to get into this space. But as I mentioned, like cannabis businesses really need smart accountants. And I'm glad that you've taken the time to watch this. And I am really excited for where you will go in the cannabis industry.
Today's event has ended. To earn CPE, go to earmark.app or scan the QR code on the screen. Then log in or create your free account. Search for the course by tapping on the magnifying glass icon on the home screen and then entering the name of this event. It takes a few days to make the course, so if you're attending this event live, keep an eye out for an email letting you know when the course is available. Pass the quiz to earn your CPE, then tap the button to email yourself a certificate. Stay tuned for more events from Earmark. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.